My name is Cris Martin, and I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. We're so glad to have you here today for the sixth session of our year-long series, Russia in Search of a New Paradigm, Conversations with Yevgenia Albats. This is the first panel of our spring semester, entitled Russian Propaganda Machine, Mechanics of Success. Today, we have the privilege of hosting Peter Pomerantsev and Dr. Nina Khrushcheva for a conversation on the impacts of Putin's propaganda machine. I invite you, our audience, to participate actively in today's discussion, which is being video recorded and will be posted to the Davis Center's YouTube channel later this week. And now I'll introduce our participants. Peter Pomerantsev is a senior fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, where he co-directs the ARENA Initiative, a research project dedicated to overcoming the challenges of digital era disinformation and polarization. He directed the same project when it was hosted at the London School of Economics previously. He is the author of several award-winning books, including Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, 2014, and This is Not Propaganda, 2019. He's a columnist at The American Interest and writes for publications including the New York Times, Granta, and The Atlantic. He frequently testifies on the challenges of information war and media development and hosts policy seminars on behalf of international and multinational government bodies. He also helped write in-depth policy recommendations on counter-propaganda and media diversity for national governments and NGOs, and continues to present and write radio documentaries for BBC Radio 4, most recently on disinformation about climate change. So you can see we're in good hands today for our conversation.
That's such a full CV. Did that come from Elon Musk? This is like broken into from the government.
I have bridged that record for the whole thing.
God.
Our website.
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
Nina
Much shorter. Yeah, you can
that. Nina Khrushcheva is a professor in the Julien J. Studley Graduate Programs of International Affairs at the New School in New York. She is an editor of and contributor to Project Syndicate, Association of Newspapers Around the World. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a recipient of the Great Immigrants, the Pride of America Award from the Carnegie Corporation, something we should all be celebrating, I think, right now, as well as a gold medal of honorary patronage from Trinity College, Dublin. Her articles have appeared in Foreign Policy, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, amongst other places. And she is the author of Imagining the Book, Russia Between Art and Politics, The Lost Khrushchev, A Journey into the Gulag of the Russian Mind, and co-author of In Putin's Footsteps, Searching for the Soul of an Empire Across Russia's 11 Time Zones. And her latest book, which I believe she has a copy of right here, is Nikita Khrushchev, An Outlier of the System. And they will be in conversation, of course, with Dr. Yevgenia Albats, Russian investigative journalist, political scientist, author, and radio host. She has her PhD in political science from Harvard University and has split her time subsequently between academia and journalism. She taught at Moscow's Higher School of Economics and has been editor-in-chief of the political weekly, The New Times, since 2007. She is also the host of Absolute Albats, which formerly ran on Echo Moskvy, but is now available on YouTube. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Yevgenia.
Chris, thank you very much for your excellent introduction. So, and thank you very much to everyone for coming. It's great, I've been missing, the possibility of these great conversations, and I hope you did too. So, as you heard, we had great speakers, and I just add a couple of details. Both of my guests were born in the USSR. In fact, I wrote both of my guests were born in Moscow. And then, Peter corrected me. In fact, he was born in Kiev. And, you were born in Moscow, correct? Yes. So, but obviously, they came from very different circles. Peter Pomerantsev is a son of Igor Pomerantsev, who was a well-known dissident and a poet, a writer, a drama writer. He worked for BBC. He went into political exile in late 1970s to London. And Nina Khrushcheva, as you can guess, yes, that's your book, right?
Story.
And Nina Khrushcheva, as you can guess, she is a granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev. For those of you who do Russian history, you should know that that was the guy who opened Gulag, who was, of course, the chairman of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, or he was a general secretary already. It was
He was
chairman.
never, ever, ever general secretary.
I'm sorry, just don't kill me.
I'm sure
No.
everybody who says he's general secretary. He was always the first secretary.
I'm the first secretary. I'm so sorry. It's just the same as the general
It's not the
secretary,
same.
but it was
Still not the same.
yes. But of course, you're totally right. Anyway, so, and, as a result of the coup d'etat in 1964, he was kicked out of Staraya Ploshchad, where the main offices of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union back then, and then he became a headache for the subsequent leaders of the Soviet Union, especially when his memoirs were published outside the country. Peter, he grew up, as I said, in London and got his education there, and then came to Moscow already, when it was, not the Soviet Union, but Russia. Nina lived in Moscow, and then she went to study to Princeton in the United States, and since then, she's back and forth. She shares her life between United States and Russia. And in fact, Nina was in Moscow for the last 7 months. She was on the ground there. It is a rare chance for us to speak to somebody who was in Moscow recently, and more, not just in Moscow, but Nina also traveled around the European part of Russia. She also went to Yekaterinburg, where she was supposed to present this volume, which, she had huge problems to publish it. For some reasons, all of a sudden, you get a 2 killers. She had problems to publish it because, first, the publisher for whom she worked decided to publish. Then they got afraid and they canceled the publication. The galleys were bought by the former editor of Echo Moskvy, Alexei Venediktov, who has his own small publishing shop called Diletant. They published this book. So, and then anyway, so there were, I think, three circulations, right?
Yes, it was 4,000 copies.
Yes, so it became, sort of bestseller in Moscow in the times when, but, it was very strange that all of a sudden, my beloved Chekists got frightened by Nikita Khrushchev. It's very nice. Yes. So Nina, so that's why, I will start with asking questions, but before I will ask questions, I have some surprise. Yes, of course, I said, about Peter Pomerantsev, that's his book. Everything is possible. Nothing is true, everything is possible. It's very interesting reading. Very, very interesting reading. Even for me, I lived through that time, but it's very interesting to read. And that's his latest 2024 book. How to Win an Information War. It is 2024. So we're going to talk about this. But first, I want, I prepared some surprise to you. So this book was published in Moscow in 1924 in one of the biggest and wealthiest publishing house in Moscow, IST. A book was translated from Italian into Russian at the expense of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Italian Republic. It is the book about the icon of the Italian cultural domain, the award-winning and internationally recognized director, Pier Paolo Pasolini. That's a book about him. Now, why? I'm sure, somebody brought me from the Moscow. That's how this book came out. Just one sec. And that's what's happening now. I mean, even in the Soviet times, I don't remember anything like that. everything that was related here to sex, to gays, to something immodest. You know, for these my lovely guys who love to have to go to saunas with boys and girls. You know, but they're so modest now, you know? It's a real book. You're welcome to see it. You know, it's done through the entire book. I mean, you know, I'm not an adherent of Pasolini, you know, I'm not a movie person, but I was trying to figure out why did they do it so in such an idiotic way?
It's not an idiotic way.
No?
No, that's what on purpose. That's exactly how it's happening there. Because that's how you fight. Because you are not going to surrender to what you are not allowed to publish this. So you're going to make fun of all of those who ordered you not to publish. So you're going to publish it like this with a message. Look what we have to do to survive here. So that book actually is a very important testament to what's happening there. That's a protest.
Please elaborate.
Well, that's a protest because
I
otherwise,
say it's a big and powerful, very loyal publishing house.
otherwise you're not going to publish it. If you have a book like that, what are you going to do? You're not going to publish a book like that. You just say, fine, you know what? Half of it cannot be seen by people over below 18 or over 18. So we're not going to publish it. Instead, they say, we are going to mock this system. We're going to publish it this way and to show you how idiotic that looks. That's a new form of protest. That's exactly what I've been seeing there for the last 3 years I was going. People try to do it any way they can. If they cannot do it any other way, that's how they do it. So that's not a surrender. That's not idiocy.
Why are they not afraid, Nina?
They
know
are
that
afraid.
all our friends,
But
all my friends are in jail.
But because, anyway, we already started a conversation.
Yes.
We haven't even gotten we haven't even gotten to questions yet. Because it is random. Because you don't know exactly, the question is how it is different from the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, you know what you can do, what you can't do. Now it's hit or miss. You can or you cannot. Some people go to jail, some cannot. Some people can put something on stage and some cannot. It is idiotic. For example, I just saw, if we talk about theater, Dmitry Krymov had his play Serezha. I don't know, you probably have seen it because it's an old one. It used to have a director. Now, if you go through the site of Mahat, the theater that is in, there's no director. Everybody's there. The light person, the costume person, the actors, but there's no director. So that's how they do it.
On the poster,
on the poster, there's just nothing like that.
Mhm.
On the other hand, the Vakhtangov Theater, they had one of the famous, he now unfortunately died, Tuminas, who right before the war did War and Peace. And at the beginning, it was
Tolstoy's War and Peace.
Tolstoy's War and Peace. It was a giant poster, and when I first got there in 22, when the war started, I started going every 6 months. And so the War and Peace was there. It's like, okay, 5 more minutes and it's going to be off. It's still there. So why would they allow War and Peace to hang? There was somebody didn't notice, or somebody said, we look idiotic. Or so what I learned also in the places that I went in all the cities, it depends very much on the leader, on whatever, the governor or the mayor. Because if the governor and the mayor say we're going to pay tribute to this, like with the book, we're going to pay tribute to what they tell us, but we're not going to go further than one has to go. Kazan in Tatarstan is saying, oh, we love Putin, we host BRICS, everything is happening, everything is great, everything is wonderful. 2 things that you see of the war. On the main square, they have this harmonica of Tatarstan at the war, and there's some heroes of whatever. And in the theater, the director said, we are very special military operation oriented. So we're just going to have the Z sign.
Let me help you.
So see, we're going to have the Z sign. That sign is ZA, which is for the war. on the theater until the war is over. I was there in December. There was no Zed. I asked, so what happened to the Zed that it was supposed to? Oh, перегорело.
And that is
Like
one of the symbols.
Right, the
of
symbol. It was
Special military.
Right, it was
operation.
supposed to blare on in electricity lights, like, just the lights burned down. It's like, but aren't you supposed to do this? Oh, we already paid tribute. And so people pay tribute and then they move on, so they cannot be accused of something. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but actually this Pasolini is going to become a very important artifact, a very important evidence of how people in conditions that you are not going to say, no, you actually have to surrender, otherwise there's too much risk. And I always say it advisingly because, what is a risk in Moscow when there is Ukraine being bombed to pieces? However, when there is a risk, that's how you express your views of that. And I think that's important. So we can mock all we can, but we also have to understand that that's a public statement. The putting it this way is a public statement. They could have just cut out these pages. They didn't have to do this. They could have cut out these pages. And how many people are going to read the Pasolini work? Some will, and some would say, oh, they could put something that this page are excluded for publication. They could have pretended that this order not to publish LGBT and everything else does not exist. And yet they show.
Right. I just, think, that it's always better to have an information rather than not to have it. We lived through that in the Soviet times when we were unable to publish, to say 1937, it was when Zochenko and Akhmatova, I lived through the times when Zochenko and Akhmatova censored. But tell me, how comfortable did you feel while in Moscow? Did you feel surveillance?
No.
Were you afraid? Tell me, how did you feel?
Well, as I said, I first got there in 22, and I was very surprised. What do I do here? Oh, here it is. So that's my that the war began. I mean, I was going before that the war began. As you could see, there's all these minions and world leaders, and there's still Johnny Depp and Elizabeth Taylor and whatnot. So in 2022, people still haven't figured out that that's what happened to them. So they're still kind of in this global environment. But that changed. I mean, by 24, you wouldn't see any of this. You would see this kind of more of those. So this 22, 23. So of course, the usual suspects, you would have Tolstoy, you will have Peter the Great, you will have Gagarin. And what's interesting, Stalin, but Stalin only appearing. I mean, that's another interesting thing. By the way, these are soaps. So if you'd like to wash your hands.
And you didn't bring anyone Stalin.
I mean, I have a lot to watch. No, of course I do. And this is, by the way, very tasty chocolate that unfortunately don't leave ours behind. So basically, it is if you're living in George Orwell. Nobody has ever lived in George Orwell. It was all written about some other country. But here you walk around and think you did it really happen to me? Is it me? Is it happening? So these are soaps, you can wash your hands. Stalin is still kind of slightly diluted by others, but here he is. I mean, that's it. He is basically everywhere now as of 22, 23. Exactly. And you see there is a lot of Putin because we want Putin, and especially this Putin is the most polite man in the world, because that's exactly how they troll those who don't like the Russians. This was a shocker. This is the Hermitage Museum. So when you have a magnet of Stalin in the Hermitage, that's kind of it gives you a little bit of a pause, because until 2023, you couldn't even imagine that this happening. So no, I wasn't afraid, but it was sort of a social experiment. I wanted to see how long I last, how long I can come in and leave and kind of pretend that I'm like Anastas Mikoyan, and I'm going to just sort of between the raindrops. Right, between the raindrops. And it didn't, it lasted until November. And then I made a mistake of agreeing to go to the Yeltsin center in Yekaterinburg. And since he's such a beloved character of the hard right, of the patriotic politicians, the combination of Khrushchev and Yeltsin, although Yeltsin hated Khrushchev. So the combination of Yeltsin and Khrushchev just suddenly became an explosive problem. Oh, and that's the Pasolini, kind of 1984. Any bookstore you go in, right in your face, everywhere up till now. It's not 23, 24, everywhere. So this is in St. Petersburg in the middle of 1984. This is a 23 display. In 24, there's a different display, 84.
I explain, what is it there? I mean,
Okay,
because I don't-
so this is this bookstore that they turned into a bookstore from a Zynga factory. So that's there.
Uh-huh.
This is another bookstore in St. Petersburg in 1984, right next to the cash register, right in your face. And I talked to a woman there and I said, you have an interesting welcome sign. And she said, we have to remember the world we live in. So people are very aware of how it's happening. So this is the Pasolini. If they can't do it any other way, they're going to do it this way. So here is your Orwell.
And Zamyatin, which
And
was prohibited
Zamyatin,
in the
and
Soviet
they're all together. And in some places, in some places that are more intellectual, they also have Huxley. So that combination of Zamyatin, Huxley, and Orwell in many, many places. So you can't so propaganda is there, but also insidious anti-propaganda is there too. So there's a reminder all the time that there's something else going on. We need to pay attention.
Why did you even get cancelled in Yeltsin Center? What happened?
Well,
They invited you, Yeltsin Center, that's Yumashev. Yumashev still, the Yeltsin son-in-law has his pass to the administration of the president. He meets with Weiner, the head of the apparatus, of Putin's apparatus. What happened?
Well, it's actually, the whole thing was interesting because I was very Mikoyan-like, and I have to say I was very proud that for 2 years I was able to get through. And then the place that commissioned this book in 2020 suddenly said, oh, we now have censorship, and so we cannot publish it. And one of the problems that they had is with this cover, by the way. So this is a cover that you cannot publish a book of Khrushchev in Russia.
Why?
Why? Because he looks too good. He cannot look. Seriously, Putin doesn't like him. That's interesting, actually. When you said Dima Muratov, when Dima Muratov didn't know the story of the cover, and he said, "Oh, what a great cover!" So this is 1962.
Dima Muratov is the Nobel Prize winner for peace, and he's the editor of the now closed Novaya Gazeta,
and yet it comes out.
And that 1999 copies.
Exactly.
That was allowed.
And yet it comes out. So this is a comparison once again to the Stalin, because there, if something's closed, it's closed. Now it's closed, it's not closed. It's published, it's not published. Anyway, so Khrushchev looks too good. So they wanted a gray, black and white photograph. It's like, fine. So they found a photograph, and then they said, well, actually, we now have censorship, so it's not going to be published. And so then, actually, Vitaly Demarsky, who is the editor of Dilettant, said, we have our own publishing house, so we're going to publish it. And so they did publish it. And I think people got interested in it. And I'm actually shocked because, unlike Peter, who is a best-selling author, I've never been a best-selling author. And suddenly, everybody wanted this book and everybody wanted to buy it. And it's very heavy and it's very expensive by the Russian standards. And I started asking why, and they said, well, because first of all, we want to know what makes people serve Stalin, because Khrushchev he wasn't talking about a Stalin flunky. He was one of the most devoted, and what it takes for somebody to turn away and say, my hands are covered in blood by the elbows, and so we need to repent. And so that became an interesting thing. So what happens, because I was also writing about a society and how people surrender to fear, but also how basically what happens to Vainoy and Kiriyenko Narishkin and Lavrov and all these Russians who originally maybe slightly more educated than they present themselves now because they have to be tough and patriotic. And so suddenly people were just reading it for this. And that was an amazing thing. Anyway, so the book came out, it was sold out, and suddenly the original publisher calls me and says, we want to publish it. I'm sorry, what? So they had to buy the rights from Dilettante to publish the book they originally commissioned, edited, and essentially designed. So, but they were afraid of this photograph and they put it inside the book. And this is a photograph, this is a portrait of done by Nadia Leger, who was Belarusian origins, the wife of Fernand Leger, who's also a Cubist. You may have seen her work of this kind. She did Gagarin, she did Ekaterina Fortsova, the Minister of Culture, Tsiolkovsky and others, but this was the first portrait. And it was a little bit of a bribe for Khrushchev because, you know, his views of art were slightly non-avant-garde, to say the least. And so she thought she's going to paint Khrushchev and he will not cancel the Cubist exhibit in Moscow. So she did. She gave it to them. My mother was there and she told me a lovely story. So she brought it in and said, well, Nikita Sergeyevich, here is the portrait. It's such a great portrait. And they put it sort of like this to the wall. Oh, thank you so much, and put it to the wall. And my mother said, oh, what a great portrait. And my grandmother then turned to her and said, why don't you take it? You like things that are so, how to translate it?
Yarky.
So, no, yarky, so, it's not outrageous, but so вопиющее. Those who speak Russian. Ты же любишь такое вопиющее.
In your face?
In your face, something in your face. So this portrait was hanging in our apartment, but nobody has ever seen it for 70 years. And suddenly it's on the book. And suddenly they afraid to publish because Khrushchev looks too good. So I was canceled. Yeltsin Center wasn't the first one. I was supposed to speak in Magazine Moskva. It's on Tverskaya, and it was all great. And then they called me a day before and said, you're canceled for technical reasons. So I know technical reasons about 5 times have been canceled for technical reasons. It's just the Yeltsin Center was the loudest because it was not about Khrushchev or me as much as it was about Yeltsin and how in the Yeltsin Center, they all, as they say, пригревают таких либеральных змей. So they warm up these liberal snakes like me. And of course, Khrushchev, because he gave, as one Duma person wrote, and she's in charge of family and children. So she wrote in her call to the prosecutor's office to investigate me because of, and Khrushchev, let's investigate. Khrushchev has been dead for how many years? Because he gave birth to such unspeakable bastards as Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. So it was that. So if I didn't go to Yeltsin Center, I would have been canceled and not canceled for technical reasons here and there. But I probably would have continued being a Mikoyan for some time to come.
I'm not sure that young people here know exactly who Mikoyan was in the Soviet hierarchy, but you know, we're not going to delve into that.
They Google. I mean, Google is your friend. So
yes, okay. But may I ask you, do people watch TV? People who were Iranian, you know, we were neighbors, you know, who live next to each other, you know. I didn't even send me the picture of my apartment building because obviously I miss my home. And so, so tell me, you know, people who you dealt with, you know, you spoke with, do they watch TV? Do they talk about the war? Are they afraid? So just
once again, I mean, it's not the Soviet Union. There's no monolith way of looking at it. It's very fragmented, like everywhere else. I mean, and people don't watch TV the way we used to watch TV. I mean, it's no longer a linear way of looking at it. A lot of people watch on their computers. A lot of people have Google TV. I don't know what's going to happen to that. So you can actually pick your channels. And very few people actually go through, as it was
But YouTube
yeah.
banned now, all my.
Well, YouTube is banned, but then there's VPN. I mean, and once
I can
again,
tell you, since I have my show each Monday, the audience in Russia is down by 40%.
Because
all of us we experienced it.
it is absolutely, it is hard and it's getting harder. And of course they're lying because they said, well, it's slowed down. It's not slowed down. You actually cannot log on, but people do log on. People still watch, they still post things on Facebook. So yes, it is down. I mean, they really.
Even though Facebook is closed, Twitter is closed.
Twitter is closed.
Instagram is closed.
Instagram is closed. All of this is closed, and yet everybody's posting. And I think when your audience is down is because it's getting harder and harder. And VPN, they also try to, so this one is closed, you have to look for another one, you have to look for the other one. So it is kind of also another thing. It's also, there's a very KGB way, I'm sure you know that better than anybody, very KGB of doing this. It's sort of this python that is going to strangle you slowly. It's not going to kill you and poison you immediately, but it's going to strangle you slowly. But it still exists. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, it's not a country that is completely turned off. You still can do this, and people do. They discuss it much less. I mean, in 22, that's the only thing people were talking about. It's the war. In fact, openly in a coffee shop, saying, bastards, what are we doing? Oh my God. And somebody would say, well, how can I find a job? How can I leave the country? Oh, my friend left the country. Can I go? If I help Ukrainians, I have family in Ukraine, what is going to happen to me and whatnot? Much less so. People are much more careful. And interestingly enough, less careful, for example, in Yekaterinburg. In Yekaterinburg, people, when I was canceled and I went to a museum because I had to do something for 2 days before I left, and people were coming up to me and saying, oh, bastards, this is ridiculous. We wrote a petition. And like, wow, you don't know me. I don't know you. What if I'm going to squeal on you that very second? And yet they didn't. Even in Yekaterinburg, there's one of the museums, they do this, used to do this museum of metal, what's the word? Metal, not construction, but metal, something. I don't even know in Russian, when you make stuff out of metal, this little metalworking, something like that. And so there's, they had periods because it began in the last Tsar, and they were actually in the Paris exhibit, their metal gazebo they put forward. So it's all there. And you go, it's 1930s, because they have parts in the museum, and there is no Stalin. And I said, where is Stalin? Where did Stalin go? Because there's all these others, Kirov and Voroshilov and Budyonny, but where is Stalin? And apparently they had a vote, and the head of that section wanted to put Stalin in, saying that's history, we have to remember. And the director of the museum said, no, we're not going to have Stalin in because we don't put murderers and killers into our exhibits, even if he was part of history. So these debates are still happening. They're less and less, because ultimately that python is going to squeeze all life out of it. But they're still there.
People, are they afraid? Just wait. Remember the Soviet times, both of us, we lived there. We had to put a pillow on the telephone because, everybody assumed that KGB was there sitting in this telephone, right? People were imprisoned for an anecdote. Now people are imprisoned for post on VKontakte. Or, I had people who are working for me out of Russia, and they're afraid to write about, anything. They still write as war, not why not. They cannot say war, right? They cannot write war. They write
Zakharova says war all the time.
Yes, it's still they're afraid.
Yes, people are afraid, but a lot of people are not afraid. And because once again, it is hit or miss. And I think it's the story of Buyanova, that children's doctor.
Pediatrician.
Right, pediatrician. That's a very important story because that's how it works. She is a random person who has been vocal, but probably didn't say whatever she was told. It was told that she said, but it was an example to everybody to be afraid. Those who are not afraid may not, for now, nothing may happen to them. But because you don't know, once again, it is random. With Stalin, you know that it's going to happen to you. So you're going to be silent. If your Stalin statue, little bust broke in your bedroom, you are going to spend the whole night turning into dust and then say, well, it was moved to another room because you cannot break Stalin. You can break, you still can. So it's not, it's fragmented. It's not the same monolith. And that's why it's so difficult, because somebody from whatever, the original publisher of this book, the commissioner of this book, in which universe they first say they cannot publish and then they publish. That cannot happen in the Soviet Union. Pasolini, like that, cannot happen in the
Especially since the commissioner of this book, one of the richest men in Russia.
One of the richest men in Russia. And then they started explaining, Patrushev, the KGB man, the main KGB man, he vetted it and he said that there's no way. I said, well, but it's still me. It's the same Patrushev, and suddenly you do. So you can't. It's almost impossible to rationalize. And that's why I keep thinking that that's how we live in Orwell, because even Orwell, when I'm there and I'm sometimes thinking, Orwell would say, I cannot write this because it's just way too far. Nobody's going to believe this because this was last April. So I'm riding around Moscow and you could see all of these things. I mean, that's your propaganda. It's in your face all the time. But the problem with propaganda like that ultimately you just stop noticing it. Like ultimately you're noticing things only that you want to notice. And that's what they did. They're not stupid. What they did afterwards now, because this is all basically almost stationary, but now it's turning around. So you have, buy this new car, or the new musical is great and wonderful. The liposuction is lovely. The hair, you can bring, you can color your hair in different colors. And then the special military operation, which is clever because it shocks you when you see it, but it's like, in war in Afghanistan, there's a ticking, so let's talk about, the great musical, and then so many people were killed today. So it actually diminishes the experience at the same time. That's what I'm talking about. I mean, that is beyond Orwell. So Barbie comes out very quickly banned. And yet here it is. And Yevgenia, this is for you. This is a depot.
It's on the street where we live.
Exactly, right.
I live on the street. Yes, that's nice.
In Moscow. So it was banned, and yet this is right inside depot, this is probably a year after. So Barbie was totally banned, and yet you have all this Barbie crap right there.
Movie Barbie also.
And this is also amazing. So this is it's December 23. Barbie came out, as you remember, in the summer. So it's already thoroughly forbidden in Russia because it's against some values of whatever. And so you walk on Nevsky, and here it is, the Barbie and Oppenheimer, and they're both forbidden because there's a problem with values, whatever kind. So here it is. And I actually talked to people who were coming out of the movie theater, and some young couple, they watched Oppenheimer. It's like, oh, it's too long. And we went just because we wanted to see why it's forbidden, because forbidding something, it's a great way of people wanting to see it. And they said, well, the movie theater will get closed probably, but very brave of them to show it. So not everybody, people are aware. And actually, by the way, the movie theater is not closed. They still continue to show it.
Even in St. Peter.
In St. Petersburg, yes. Because St. Petersburg is also interesting. It's kind of, in Moscow, things that because it's so much going on. But in St. Petersburg, and also they hate Putin more. So you kind of, it's clearer. So all of this that's what I mean by war is peace, ignorance and strength. It's just, Orwell would say, I cannot invent this because nobody's going to believe my formulas. It's just way too outrageous. But it is happening right there in your face.
And what's that?
Oh, anyway, it kind of turned into a presentation. Part of the propaganda also is that almost basically the Soviet and empire comes at you from everywhere. So you go to the Russian Museum, and you have this exhibit, the scenes of life at war. And you imagine that the scenes of life at war, it's all to the SWAT, to the special military operation. It's a tribute to the special military operation. Then you go in and it's a destruction upon destruction upon destruction. But the chinovniki, the apparatchiks, they're not going to go and see the exhibit. They just see they see the title and that's it. And so people actually go there because they wanted to see the destruction of war. And that's another kind of clever way of circumventing what's being pushed at you. But at the same time, almost every exhibit is about something Soviet. So this is the Museum of Decorative Art, and supposedly kind of artistic every day in the USSR. Kind of very liberal people put it on, but you could see Soviet achievements. This is a Sputnik. This is, Khrushchev. I thought I couldn't resist to do the Sputnik by Vologda factory called Snezhinka or Snowflake in 1960. So basically, even if you don't want to have Soviet surrounded you, it surrounds you everywhere because the museums are pressured to have references to Soviet life.
To Soviet Empire or to Russian Empire? Or
And
to
that's another kind of a fascinating thing here. So mostly Soviet, but this is, I don't know if you remember in 23, Putin started talking about the cultural code. Suddenly the cultural code of Russia, the unity of the people, of the nations and whatnot. And once again, not stupid, actually quite creative. So the Hermitage had this statuettes, the porcelain dolls that were studied being done during Nicholas II for the anniversary of the Romanov house. And so they started doing that. They didn't finish because revolution happened. So now they pulled them out of the basement, finished them up. So they're 400 nations for 400 statues there. And you could see the culture, the Russian nation, the Russian nationals, the cultural code. And it's also incredibly clever because it's given for 3 months to every region and it travels around Russia. And so everybody sees what a wonderful multinational country it is. And when you go far, people don't pay attention that much. So when you have the Georgians there and the Armenians are there and the Malarussians, the Ukrainians are there. So somebody who comes in and says, oh, these are beautiful dolls. Oh my God, all these are the nations. They're all ours. So that's how you also make they become ours, even if they're not ours. The Moldovans, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, part of the Russian Empire, 400 of them. And so that's another part that comes to you. And Peter knows it much better than I do, but how propaganda really hits you here. You don't even know how it came into your brain, kind of Orwell thing, that 2 + 2 is 5. And so so the imperial and the Soviet, and of course the war. So you have this ribbon, the current formula of patriotism, the military patriotism, and you just add it to the old story. And that's how you connect it to today. So this is a beautiful place. That's where they do golden embroidery. It's not far from Tver. Very tiny town.
50 kilometers.
Yeah,
from Moscow, yes.
It has nothing. It has really nothing against. It's nothing. It's a very small town, but the golden embroidery was amazing thing. And until 22, it was in great disarray, the Museum of Golden Embroidery. In 22, suddenly they decided it's going to be serving their propaganda. And so they put up Stalin, they put up all this religion. I love when religion and Stalin and Lenin, they're all together, but here it is. These are all, you can see from here, but these are pictures of Stalin, Voroshilov, Medvedev, and Putin. So they're all doing the Tibeteika and whatnot. So it comes to you, basically, my point is it comes to you from different angles. And if you are not trained to see it, or if you are not looking for it, it's very hard to escape. Ultimately, that becomes the cocoon you live in. And yes, there you can do VPN, you can do this, but this is surrounding you 24/7. And that's how, and so it's, once again, propaganda needs to be total. And in some ways, this is a very total propaganda, but it's also porous, unlike the Soviet, because you can still break it or come in from in different holes. Kind of a favorite Putin thing, because he's a judo master, so he sees an opening here, he goes in, and suddenly it's a war. It's sort of this porous way of existing today actually somewhat helps Russia. It doesn't save it, but it somewhat helps Russia.
Last question before, I will ask Peter to speak. Attitudes towards war. We understand that in this type of regimes, real pollsters, almost don't exist. It's very difficult to run, even though, I understand that people are trying to do it somehow. But what is your, being on the ground, what did you feel? Did people support the war? The majority of people support the war, or they don't? And did you see any deviation, in small cities or, in the cities outside Moscow? Do people, feel different in the provinces than Moscow? No, because once again, I remind you, we lived through the Afghan war, when, at some point, all these corpses that were coming back from Afghanistan and, Russian cities, Pskov, Voronezh, etc., they were wailing, they were burying, their young and, their sons and brothers, etc., on a daily basis. Now we know, numbers, about 700,000 dead and wounded. So what's the attitude towards war? Is it different?
I think at the beginning it was very negative, and it's getting less and less negative. And it also depends on the places. I did have pictures here, but I was in Omsk last year, in villages around Omsk, and I was shocked because suddenly there's beauty salons all over villages. I mean, how many beauty salons you have in villages? Usually people go to big cities to do their nails, but suddenly there are 3 of them for a tiny village of, 70 people. And it's some hut, kind of an old hut, almost broken, but it says beauty salon in English, which is insane, because you're supposed not to have a beauty salon in English. And I walked in, and the women there, and one of them was a widow, and she said, well, I'm a widow now, and thank you to Putin, now live well, and I have to make myself beautiful because I'm going to marry again. Or my husband is serving the war, and thank you to Putin because now our economic conditions are better, because in these places, especially places that produces arms, they're really living better. Because another thing, and everybody knows that, but it's worth mentioning, that kind of empowering small life through the great idea of the state is a very powerful way of doing it. Suddenly small life becomes needed for this greater project of unique civilization, or whatever Putin is doing, saying he's doing with the war. But it also depends on, what I found remarkable, it depends on the city. It depends on town. As I said, in Yekaterinburg, they have the most squealing, it seems, from all the cities, and yet they are the most open in saying how horrible it is. You get into a cab, this is such a trite story, you get into a cab, you start talking to a cab driver, but most of the time you get out of the cab, you want to hug the cab driver, because the cab driver is like, what the hell, where are the people, what are that, and usually it's, great Russian language of things that I cannot repeat here. And so, and a lot of them are from other countries, a lot of them from Central Asian countries, and the Russian state is very kind to them right now because suddenly they found an enemy that they need to eliminate. And some of them lived in Russia forever. They married to Russian women, and they're being stopped. We were in a cab, and suddenly the guy got stopped from Kazakhstan because he looks Kazakh, and then of course he has all the documents and whatnot. But it's humiliating, and so we talk to them, and you see how non-monolith it is, and how even sort of in Yekaterinburg, even the state media, whatever, something that is supported by the governor's office. There's a guy who I had an interview with, and then of course they couldn't publish it because suddenly I was persona non grata. He used to be at Echo Moskvy. He was in Echo Moscow, Ekaterinburg. So it just depends on if they trust you enough to tell you. But in some places it is, yes. I mean, I was in Kostroma, which is a remarkable city. And there was a woman selling Stalins, just Stalin, 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 Stalin. And I said, well, you're selling a mass murderer. And she said, well, my grandfather gave his life to the organ, gave his life to the security, right, to the state security. And I'm a proud descendant. And I said, well, unfortunately, then we're going to disagree. And she said, well, but it's wonderful if everybody's going to be healthy. And I said, yeah, because then we'll die and we're all going to be healthy. And she said, but would you like to buy? Would you like to buy instead? It's like, no, thank you, I don't. But it's kind of, it's once again, it's not a Soviet monolith. There is no monolithic anything. It's very porous and very different. And so to conclude, there's other things in it. So Putin and see an old Putin and war and Putin and war. This was amazing. This was the most militant city I visited. This is Tula, where they produce cannons. This was the most.
It is a military
This
city.
was unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, that
Industrial complex city.
that was the whole thing. I mean, for peace, for Russia, for president, for the army, for bravery, for truth, and of course, and I love for peace and doves with all the cannons that they produce. Just once again, very Orwellian. Soviet nostalgia. Doesn't matter. Harry Potter is our everything, by the way. He's forbidden. He's forbidden because J.K. Rowling's forbade it. And yet, wherever you go in every city, there's something Harry Potter is. and when I tell them that it's forbidden, they say, really? Because nobody's aware of it, and nobody's going to cancel it. And so this is. You ask about the returning. So this soldier, I took a picture myself. He's missing his left arm. So this will be more and more. But once again, Putin doesn't want to repeat the Afghan mistake when these people came in and they were not needed by anybody. So now they're becoming governors, they're becoming mayors, they're studying to become the greatest thing that happened to humanity. And he said this is going to be our elites. Oh, and actually, this is an old presentation. I deleted the cities just in case. So this is a Murom. This is a monastery in Murom. And I was having a conversation with people. We were discussing whether it's a specific message about Ukraine or not. And that, well, it cannot not be. So it is a specific message.
Because colors, Ukrainian
Exactly.
colors.
It's the
Yellow and
right.
blue.
And it's
Yeah.
sort of, it's a monument to the dead.
Yes, I know that.
It's a monument to the dead. And this is also, so this is Yaroslavl, and this is in Murom, this top one. And I asked, I said, well, isn't it a little brave because you can get arrested? I don't know, these are very beautiful colors and they sell products really well. So these people say to me, so once again, it's not.
But you sound more optimistic than when, we spoke when you came.
Well, I was very
program.
freaked out.
Yes. Nina, thank you very much. I'm going to return back to you now, Peter. So do you see, you saw, these examples of this current Russian propaganda. To which extent it's different, the techniques, the language, the tools from what it was in the Soviet times, and to which extent you see that, because many people say that the current contemporary Russian propaganda is very effective, that it does have impact on Russians. So, what is yours?
So listen, I was born in the Soviet Union, but I only had time to throw up over it. And then my parents left and I was 9 months old. So it's very hard for me to judge anything about Soviet.
Probably something about that, no?
Right, yeah. I read a couple of books, but I mean, I never studied. I mean, when I lived in Moscow, 2001, 2010, it was obviously a very, very different propaganda system, based on manipulating kind of a pseudo democracy, which is clearly not. Now it seems to be that was an imitation democracy. What you're talking about sometimes feels a sort of a pastiche on dictatorship, but with with
capitalism in it.
yeah, and bits of gaps. So listen, I mean, look, usually this is quite a surprising position for me because usually I'm surrounded by very serious data-driven academics, and I'm the one telling the great anecdotes. This time it's going to be the other way around because Nina's actually been in Russia, and because I haven't been there since 2014, in the utter agony of trying to understand what's happening there, I've had to turn to completely alternative ways of understanding what's going on there. But some of the conclusions echo Nina's. Let me go through some slides. So at the start of the war, I wanted to know what was going on there, and also my last book is actually a book about how the British launched a covert campaign to subvert Nazi propaganda. So I want to help subvert
Sorry, I haven't read it yet.
Kremlin propaganda today. And so I turned to actually a team of people who are at Harvard, and sort of like came up with the idea. I'll come back to stuff later. Said, how can I know what's going on in Russia without going there? And the sociology is hard. I think we will come back to the sociology. I think there's things you can do with sociology. And so what they did, and one of them here, tell you more about it, was kind of did this incredible data fusion of putting in all the available social media sources. Everybody does that. All the available state media sources, then all the economic data, all the behavioral data, basically all the data that you can get from Russia into a kind of a data crunching machine to try to understand what was going on there or give some sort of perspective. And I think once you partner the wonderful sort of anecdotal visual stuff that Nina has, that the data people have, that the sociologists have, you start to get a three-dimensional picture, approximation of how the propaganda works. But I'll give you a couple of little things. So this is sentiment around NATO and Russian news. One of the things that we do is we contrast what is being said in the state media, in the news, and on the social media. Now, social media there is some censorship, and then you can say things. So look, there's a discrepancy often between what's said on the state media and in the social media. And by looking at that discrepancy, we can see where the propaganda has difficulties, yeah? Because as we see, something like NATO, this is what they're saying in Russian news. Basically, NATO did something naughty in August 24, I can't remember what it was. And news is like, that's the sentiment going down. It's basically, that's Russian state news goes, NATO is evil. And on social media, people are saying, NATO is evil, which either means the troll farms are working or people are agreeing with it. But this is something they don't dare or don't want to disagree with, yeah? But the minute you get away from something like that to the question of salary increases, as you know, yes, there is this huge economic kind of boom, fake boom in Russia. But at the same time, salaries, aren't keeping up with the rate of inflation. So even though there is actually high employment, people don't necessarily feel the economic benefits. A little bit like under the Biden era here, but more extreme. So this is Moscow Oblast. So you see the sentiment in the news on salary increase going up and up and up. And if you sort of like delve into that graph, you'll find lots of sort of slightly Soviet-style articles and news pieces saying, your salary is better than it has been before. The wonderful salary increases are even greater. The farmers and the bakers of Moscow Oblast are very happy at their salaries. And some of it is actually like that. Some of it really feels like, here we are opening a new factory sort of propaganda. But online, you can see it's completely different. So that means people are complaining about it.
When you say online, what do you mean exactly?
So it is, some of the data experts are in this room, but it is all types of social media forums, do a lot of that as well. So you're scraping up all the kind of conversations people are having on VK, on Telegram. City forums are very interesting. There's all these forums in Russia which are still actually used, or professional forums, veterans forums, bakers forums, sports forums. People are actually, there's less censorship on them. People talk more there. Look, all of this is a massive approximation, yeah? But again, you see straight away, look, there's stuff people can complain about and complain about quite angrily. Another one, is another big topic that people seem to be very, very annoyed about online and don't believe the propaganda is the topic of taking out, well, in England we call them payday loans. You know, when you like take out really bad loans because you're an academic and you don't have enough money. And yeah, we know payday loans at Harvard. And the government's always trying to stop people from doing that. They're like, don't do that. The ruble is fine. You shouldn't take out any loans. And actually, Russians are taking them out like crazy. Basically, I won't get into the details, but when you see these sort of crazy up and down spikes on social media, that's a troll farm saying, don't take out payday loans. The ruble is strong. And people are like, no, we don't believe in the ruble. We're going to take out payday loans. We don't have enough money. And then there's a troll farm saying, no, you must stop this. So again, there's this battle going on in the social media space between sort of the state-sponsored propaganda, the sort of troll farms they use, and what people say. So again, it's quite, it's quite an active discussion on things like that. The reason we looked at Samara Oblast was because Samara is doing very, very well economically on paper, as in like, it's a boom place, like, all the Volga regions, everywhere around there, huge boom in their industrial production.
Industrial complex.
Yeah, exactly. So the Volga region, if you look at this is what's so interesting in Russia. If you look at the kind of economic data for Samara region, it is boom town. Businesses opening, salaries, sort of unemployment going down. People are spending like crazy on restaurants. All the behavioral data tells you of a kind of a golden age. Then you go to what people are saying online, and all they're doing is complaining about, largely to do with inflation, largely to do with the fact that even though there's so much economic activity, they feel poor, they had to take out payday loans. So there's this tension even in Samara. If we're talking about regions, there's a new, as we all know, there's always been different types of polarization in Russia. The new type of polarization that we're seeing is actually between the economic winners and the economic losers of the war. So the economic winners are obviously the military-industrial complex regions around the Volga. And then in the Far East, on the border with China, those regions are doing incredibly well because of the new trade with China. The places that have lost out and are really angry, if you were doing some sort of, counter-propaganda activity, you would probably look at regions along the western border. Pskov, places like that, who have been really affected by the lack of trade with the rest of Russia. Kaliningrad, all these places, they're kind of the economic losers. So there's a new polarization in the country to do with the war as well. This is on medical services. Again, this is the next one that really matters. Something that people are really, really upset about is, bad medicine that's on the market. That's a really, really big issue. Anything to do with sort of health supplies, health services. And again, there's non-stop sort of campaigns by the state saying, we have opened a new hospital, or we've opened a new pharmaceutical factory in suburban Moscow that will produce medicines that are better than anywhere in the West. And you can see the government trying to push that propaganda and people disagreeing with it and saying, no, this is rubbish. We want other types of medicine. So these are all, there is nothing as good as sort of actually being there. But looking at this sort of like dynamic between what the state propaganda is saying, what people are saying online, gives you a sense of the differences. I mean, so
Wait a second, do you want to say that
yeah,
like it was in the Soviet Union, the propaganda in fact ineffective? That people do listen to all this bullshit that comes out of the TV from their TVs, but they don't trust us the way we didn't trust the Soviet propaganda when they were telling us that we were building, tomorrow it's going to be communism, and tomorrow there was no fish in this market and meat across the street.
So there is meat and fish. I don't think it's a meat and fish issue, but clearly on the economic stuff, there is scope for criticism, for a little bit of pluralism. Look, take China. Yeah, Putin is totally like saying all the time how wonderful the relationship with China is, how big the investments are. if you actually look at the business newspapers, the forums for like elite conversation about the economy, you can still hear academics, business experts saying this is all bullshit. That, you know, business of China is very weak, that we're actually in a very bad position vis-a-vis China. So there's all these different spaces and topics that you are allowed to talk about stuff. And then on state media, you can't talk about that, obviously. So it is a much more complicated picture. Certainly when it comes to the economic stuff, there seems to be a lot of scope for being allowed to voice criticism. It can also be that people are sublimating a lot of criticism into that. That I can't tell, but there's definitely variation. In terms of the propaganda working, not working, so this is from a bit of sociology I've been doing. I'm not a sociologist, but like I try to feed into the question, and we were much more about this question about what you hear on state TV, the questions about identity, which I think Nina just mentioned, this idea of a large sense of grandeur being popular among people, that we're part of something big. And what this sort of survey did, and the survey was online, on telephone, checked in little groups to make it as precise as possible. All caveats apply for any kind of polling in a very unfree system. But we were really trying to like borrow into this question of identity. Yeah. And essentially, we were using an approach that you know, looked at the relationship between support for the war and other attitudes, and its relationship with different models of identity. And kind of we're looking at it in a scale. Identity as something quite aggressive, where you feel not simply that your country is nice, but that it's better than others.
Because you're dependable variable, right?
Yeah. So that's kind of like, yeah, probably was a variable. Anyway, that's the question I always find out about. And then it went down from I'm proud of my country, I think my country's better than others, down to other things. And we kind of did find that there was kind of people who were more supportive of the war, yeah? And that's an AI-generated image there on the left, top left. That's an active supporter of the war. We did not draw that. Like AI produced that. The more, basically, look, the more supportive you are, the more you have this chauvinistic idea of identity. Then you have loyalists who have they're kind of patriotic but less chauvinistic, and then you have critics who are less. So this sense of chauvinistic identity in the survey was deeply connected to your support for the war. Again, the more TV you use, the more likely you are to have that chauvinistic model of identity. So something there is genuinely working. If we're asking, is it working? No. That sense of chauvinistic identity is there. We can go on and on. That's our, again, nothing, this really was AI. This is the chauvinistic. So our survey had them at 55% of the population. So over half the population. Look, segmentations are, we could probably take this 55% and segment it further. But, you know, in the segmentation that we did, so over half the country displayed some of these chauvinistic attitudes.
When you say chauvinistic attitude,
as in like my country.
What kind of nationalism? Russian nationalism or imperialist nationalism?
So it was Russia.
We're great because we're Russians.
Where Russia is superior to, I think Russia, I don't know if we got into the ethnicity. That's a very good question. I don't know if we did that one. But it was all about how Russia is superior to other nations. Yeah, we are better than other nations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can go back to which specific ones. I don't think we got into questions of ethnicity though. I don't think it was about, I know what you're trying to ask. I don't think we got into that level of detail. But here's where it gets more interesting, yeah? With critics, we had around 11%. Here's about whether the propaganda is working, yeah? So we then, in the survey, asked these different groups questions which I think were a way of asking something about the war that was safe. Because obviously, you know, it is hard to ask about the war in a survey because obviously people are very suspicious. But this one we kind of said, look, Putin has said, yeah? So both of these are things that Putin has said, and Putin has said we should start negotiating peace tomorrow, and the other one, Putin wants the war to go on. So it's both Putin has said, and Putin, by the way, has said both these things. So this isn't something that people should be scared of. Yeah, we're trying to find a way of asking people things that they wouldn't be scared of. And essentially, cutting a very long story short, if people had been primed with questions about identity, they were much more likely to say they want Putin to continue the war. If they hadn't received a bunch of questions about identity beforehand, they were much more likely to say they want peace. So essentially, if you've just been prodding people saying identity, 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 they don't want peace. If you don't talk to them about identity and just talk about, I don't know, inflation, they're more likely to say they want peace. Sorry, more, well, you know what I'm saying. Right. So again, what we're trying to get to in our very Kasalapi way, you know, because this is all very like, you know, like all these data sets, they're so attempts at approaching a reality. But it does suggest that it does work. If you prod the identity issue, if you prod the question like, are we better than others? People seem to then be more supportive of war. And if you don't manipulate that, then people are more likely to go for peace. Again, these are the different ways I've been trying to probe what people really think and feel. They're all, you know, they're all approaches with massive kind of caveats attached to them. But to your question, does it work? Yes, sometimes, depending on the context. Oh, I'm trying to switch this off. Yeah, I think so. Good.
The end of the presentation?
Yeah, I think so. I think I've ended there.
Okay.
There's more, but I think we've had enough.
Thank you very much. Tim, may I ask you, you did, study of public opinion in Russia in mid-90s with Michael McCullough, who had a book, right, at the end of 90s. So what conclusion do you draw out of this research? Do you think we can rely on this type of data? What do you think?
Well, I think it's a question. Another question is very much that. It is discussed a lot by people who do this kind of work. I think there are ways you can minimize the risk, but it's real. But there are techniques for doing this that are pretty well developed. I'm sure Graham Robertson, for one, would be very familiar with it. So I think it's worth trying, and there's probably a lot to be learned. Yeah, we started doing this work in the mid-90s and did it without impediment until fairly recently. We still do some of this stuff. There are Russian contractors who will do it. They're taking a certain risk, perhaps, and they're familiar with the danger, the various biases that can be there. But I think both our speakers were clear on one point, which is that this kind of evidence, whether it's taking photographs in the markets or doing survey work or scanning the social media, if you're doing it right, and if you know what you're talking about, there should be some mutual reinforcement. So we shouldn't be shocked that one kind of evidence produces one set of conclusions and the other doesn't. And in these two particular cases, it seems to me they're quite reinforcing, and from that point of view, rather reassuring. Now, it is easier to say what Russia is not than what it is. It's not a monolith, for sure. What exactly it is and how we choose to label it, and whether the current synthesis is going to persist after the war, that's another matter. But as we all know, it's very hard to predict the future, especially in Russia.
But why during the Soviet times, everybody laughed at Brezhnev, People didn't trust whatever was coming out of TV. Propaganda obviously didn't work. And we didn't have, back then social networks. We didn't have alternative information. We had Radio Liberty, BBC, Voice of America. That's basically all alternatives we had. Why now people are much more prone to believe in what they're told? Why they don't laugh at Putin? In fact, many of them, they're in love with him. Why?
I'm not sure I'm going to answer that question, but I don't think that what we heard today suggests that everybody believes everything that they're being told.
So,
And sometimes, of course, it's true. I mean, it's not all fantasy. It's not all made up. Russia is at war with the West now, essentially. And so it shouldn't be shocking that many Russians will, after this initial shock, which Nina summarized for us, rally around the flag. It may not last forever, it probably won't. But this is a rather short war, in terms of the wars that the US has fought. But as for, do they fall for it? I think the message, as Nina said, this is not Soviet propaganda. It's different, it's more subtle, and it's messier, and it has its ridiculous side, of course. But just take the basic thing, there's no personality cult. It's a personalized regime without a personality cult. That's hard to imagine in terms of a Soviet experience. So of course, there are some similarities. And if I was a Russian, especially if I was living in Russia, I would be deeply concerned about them. But it's not in black and white. So I commend both speakers for getting that across.
thank you so much. Yes, Tina?
Can I just sort of add to when you said we laughed at Brezhnev? It has been 70 years. So of course, originally propaganda was quite successful because it actually delivered the working class better conditions, at least better than they originally was. But all these hopes, I think you were talking about the fake democracy, or sort of the fake version of democracy of the Soviet.
Yes, and what are you
Union.
thinking about? Novosibirsk happened, in 1963, people came out
Novosibirsk,
of the
so
streets.
few people knew of Novosibirsk. Novosibirsk was hardly known. Hardly known. Oh, please. It was a weird Soviet formula, is that you're not talking about the event, but then you have trials of those who participated. They were actually open trials. But Novosibirsk, we learned as en masse. We learned about Novosibirsk much later. But this is all later times. This is, I think Tim said that it has been 3 years. It's not enough. And actually, it is very similar, in some ways, very similar to the Brezhnev. But at the same time, I think what helps, and we didn't talk about this, is, show me the country that wants to be defeated. That whole onslaught on Russia needs to be defeated, that's also on TV. And when it was on TV.
Vietnam War in the United States.
Pardon me?
Vietnam War.
Vietnam War in the
Half of
United
the
Well, to
country didn't
some,
want to
I
get defeated.
right, but I wouldn't compare them directly, but this is all kind of the animosity from the outside actually helps Putin quite a bit, because I remember when Josep Borrell would say, now he's retired, would say something, it would be just running on TV all the time.
General Secretary of NATO.
Well, he was right, he was a diplomat of NATO. And without even suggesting, yes, he's a diplomat, he wants more war and whatnot. Of course, it was propaganda because it was too much of it. But ultimately, that's exactly what was happening. So I don't think we can compare the late Brezhnev, when everybody knew. Remember that great expression, great joke, is that they pretend that they pay us and we pretend that we work. It's different now. It's not of the same. It's not of the same pretense, but also economy did go down, but there's still no lines. You still can press a button and whatever, your food is coming to you. The services are still available. I think when economy collapses and people would be standing in line, then all hell will break loose. But for now, they're keeping it afloat. And I think what seems to me the case is because Putin now is clearly descendant of Stalin. As a descendant of Stalin, he doesn't think he's going to die. So basically, it's for the time that all of this is needed for the time he's in, because the world doesn't exist outside of Stalin. I learned it from doing research in my book, because Stalin really thought that he's going to be there forever. That paranoia, he talked about sometimes that he would die. He would say to his disciples, oh, you are like blind kittens, the West is going to eat you up. But he really didn't think he's going to die. For Putin, it's, I'm going to go in history as this. But whatever happening after that, That's not my concern. So I
Thank
think
you. I think, I'm sorry, I have some narrative about, the way the Soviet propaganda worked, how it was taught. I graduated from the Department of Journalism of MGU, and the male part of the student body, they were prepared as propagandists, and there were, specific topics that they were taught how to do propaganda. But unfortunately, I don't think we have time for that, Maybe, I will just put it on somehow, on the YouTube, we'll find out how. Because I really want to give now space to the audience to ask questions. Please, yes, Mark Kramer, of course, Mark.
Could I, in light of what Tim has said in both speakers, could I ask, it's a point that Genya briefly raised, but the war in Afghanistan lasted 9 years and there were 14,500 soldiers killed. This war has lasted 3 years, and there've been, 25 times that number killed. So why? I mean, it's not to say there wasn't popular outrage in the Soviet Union about the number killed, but still, it does seem surprising that he wouldn't, especially in regions like Dagestan and Buryatia and others in which casualties have been much greater than in other regions, that you wouldn't have popular protests breaking out. I mean, there have been a few, the wives of soldiers who were killed have gone out onto the streets in a few places, but nothing like happened, say, during the first war in Chechnya, when there was, and again, Russia was a different place than compared to now. That popular protest was feasible, and the media were mostly independent and the like. So, if you could comment on that specific issue about why having an entire generation almost partly wiped out hasn't sparked outrage.
Thank you, Mark. Who's going to pick up the question?
I mean, again, I think Nina's actually in a much better place than I am. But what I've seen in the research I've come across, so look, firstly, there's the obvious thing. When they did mobilization for the whole country, 1 million people left, and they didn't do it again. Yeah, so it's something that they are actually kind of very careful around, and they distribute it around the country in certain ways, and they create all these economic perks. Miscellaneous bit of data, talk to journalists and sort of human rights activists. The main complaints are not about death. Yeah, the main complaints from the families of service people is that they're not being paid the money they were promised to be paid. Yeah, for the beauty salon. Lots of stories about how people, sort of Russian soldiers, are left, as they famously are, lying on the battlefield on purpose, because then the body isn't identified, then you don't need to pay. So all the tensions are about money and about that contract among those people, the people involved. Among the general population, the most strong story is about the rise in crime as a consequence of the war. So the release of the convicts into the army and from there into society is a huge issue. And actually, like when I talk to journalists, they basically say that that is the only issue that will get the most patriotic, chauvinistic bits of society upset. And I think it's because those people are more than ready to admit sacrifice for the big idea, but the undermining of order, because they'll be obsessed with order and security and the strong hand, that worries them. So that's what I see in the very sort of like, poring over bits of data and talking to journalists. So if you were, so there could be outrage, and they are careful around it. We saw that with mobilization, one of the few moments when they've sort of, essentially changed policy. But those would be the main issues that seem to rile people.
But they also catered to no Afghanistan and no Chechnya. They would come back and they would be completely lost. And now they are a lot. I mean, if you travel around and you see all these billboards, some sanatoriy, whatever, some convalescent place. So now a lot of those places, actually, people can go on vacation, but they also have special wings. They build special wings where people come and convalesce. So they are treated in a very different way. They are treated, so they are the heroes that defended the motherland from the onslaught of Western hatred. So it's a very kind of KGB figuring out how to influence your mind. But it will, I mean, it will happen. It just hasn't happened yet, because I only saw one person without an arm, and there will be many, many more coming after this convalescing experience, because for now they're hidden in all these sanatoriums where they stay for 6 months, for a year. They paid off. I mean, some of them are not, but a lot of them are paid off. But once they start coming out and once they start walking the streets, that's going to happen. We just don't know how long they're going to be hidden away, because that's
what
another.
Stalin did. He sent all these amputees to Volan,
Here you go.
to the
Here you go. So
island
Yeah.
near St. Peter.
it depends on how long they're going to hide them.
When my mother emigrated, well, my parents emigrated in 78. My mother's first shock from the West was suddenly seeing disabled people everywhere. She's like, is there something wrong with the West? And she's like, oh no, they've been hidden away in the Soviet Union. I mean, this was her first impression. I mean, the bananas and the disabled people. And she's like, what's going on?
Yeah, for those who are interested in the subject, it's very interesting. There is, Yuri Nagibin wrote a big piece, there was famous writer in the Soviet Union, and he wrote a big piece about this Valan. It was, this island where Stalin and then, subsequent Soviet leaders sent all these amputees, thousands and hundreds of thousands of them who came from the World War II. And all of a sudden, at some point, they just disappeared from the streets of Moscow, St. Peter, Leningrad, and etc. And so they were sent to Valan. Other questions, please? Yes, please.
So I used to go to the Soviet Union and Russia from the mid-80s to the mid-90s. And I actually have a lot of good memories. I made friendships. I remember a lot of positivity. And then I stopped going after 94 because I had the sense the mafia was just taking over. And then I got married. And
Are those things related?
I got married here. And my wife said, I'd love to go to Russia someday. And now this has happened, the war with Ukraine. And I look at the attitude of Russians towards Ukrainians, and I'm horrified. I could not bring my wife to Russia with such attitudes. And I don't know if that will change, when it will change, if it will happen in my lifetime. But that, to me, is something I find completely unacceptable, the way Russians look at Ukrainians.
You don't have a question.
Is that going to be fixed? Ever?
By who?
The people.
People are cowards, unfortunately, not just in Russia, but in many other countries. But anyway.
Well, can I just weigh in with an answer or an attempt at an answer? I think in this too, Russia isn't monolithic. There was some terrific reporting done, especially early on in the war, about the Russians who at great risk to themselves were helping Ukrainians get back to Ukraine. So as Nina has described and Yevgenia showed with the redacted book, people are in the spaces that are afforded to them. Those who do think differently do what they can when they can, as much as each is able. So in that way too, don't forget that it's not a monolith, if that's any.
But when you were there, did you not notice the jokes about Chachli? Did you not notice the?
It wasn't that. I would have never imagined. What I remember at the kitchen table was when Ukraine became independent. Oh, what about the nukes? Oh, they don't want them. Oh, that's good. What about our summer holidays in the Black Sea? Oh, the Ukrainians say you can still come. What about the Black Sea Fleet? Oh, we can still be there. Okay, well, no problem. I mean, I never would have imagined that there would be this war. I was wrong.
Yes, please, Sergei Plekhin.
Yevgenia mentions Yevgenia mentioned that during the Soviet times, the alternative was BBC and Voice of America and Deutsche Welle. And I wonder to what degree today the Voice of America, BBC, Deutsche matter or don't matter at all. So what, who is listening, who is watching, who is connecting to that, how much information people get from outside of Russia or care about that information.
Yeah.
Yeah, largely from that survey, largely it's the 11% of liberals. So if you're looking at the segmentation we had, the patriotic 55%. One of the things that defines them is that they both watch and say they trust the sort of Russian news, state news. The other lot, they watch and follow Russian state media of different types, but they don't necessarily trust it. And then the liberals are the ones who tune into other stuff. Look, I think if you look back at what the West did in the Soviet times in terms of supporting media and other types of information into the Soviet Union, it was really actually a very wide range of activities. There was it wasn't just Radio Liberty, which was the Russian branch. It was Radio for Europe in many, many, many different languages. It was talking about issues that were really kind of sore points for the Soviet system. And we still don't know how effective they were, but they were very intentioned as there's this very famous document which was written by Richard Pipes, for his strategy to sort of defeat the Soviet Union. And he definitely saw the support of dissidents, different types of information activity as part of a war. And the point of the war was to get rid of the regime. Or I won't say regime change, but a new type of regime. Because you can't use that word because it got polluted. But today, if we were to do something like then, if we were to make any kind of comparison, it would have to start with a much more effects-driven approach. What are the vulnerabilities of this information ecology? So the fact that we haven't done a huge media targeting Russian soldiers and their families shows that we're unserious about tackling Russia. You would think about regions, you think about social classes. You definitely wouldn't be thinking about the intelligentsia. They're actually quite well catered to, and they're not a political force at the moment. So you would think about those sorts of things, and then you would think about a much larger theory of change. What's the point of any of this? But we have no Richard Pipes writing a note to Donald Trump. We have Musk tweeting at Donald Trump and repeating Kremlin propaganda. So we're in a very different world to that. So yeah, I mean, it's really quite remarkable the extent of efforts that were put in the Cold War. The supporting of Ukrainian dissident journals. I mean, it was a whole effort which played some sort of part in winning the Cold War. We have nothing like that today, sadly.
Well, very difficult to do today, once again, because it's porous and fragmented. Because there you know what's bad and what's good, and people who live in that bad world don't know the good world, so they can actually listen to what the good world is. But now a lot of Russians know what the West is, and the West is not necessarily something that they'd like to emulate. So it's so many Russians now that I talk to, they say, we want our Russia back. We don't want to immigrate because we don't think that the West is that, because the West, as you know, was that land of the free and land of opportunity. The West is not seen this way anymore. So it would be very difficult to present the same kind of...
Well, as I explore in my latest book, we have a very rich tradition of understanding that dynamic in our struggles with authoritarian regimes. And I think you're quite right. Just taking a cut and paste from Cold War tactics is wouldn't work the same way. But I think it's clear from both our presentations that this is a propaganda model rife with cracks and vulnerabilities. Just nobody is doing anything.
First, thank you so much for such an interesting conversation, and all this material is great. My question is about for those who are interested in the subject, we already learned, heard, and read so much about Russian propaganda. My question, are there academic research in different academia, sociology, economy, maybe media studies about how to break the propaganda? If I just lower this question, in my case, I don't know how to speak with my own parents who live in Moscow. I'm Russian also, and I live here for many years. But we stopped understanding each other. So now, at this point, I'm looking for the information about these magic words or strategies about on how to break the wall of propaganda. You know, maybe it's about psychiatry, sociology, I don't know, but I'm really interested in getting this information.
Thank you. Nina?
No, I think Peter's. Psychiatrist.
Psychiatrist.
So look, there's a lot to think about. We can chat afterwards if you like. It'll be easier. I think there is research being done, but for obvious reasons, it can't be very public. And there's different sort of like, you know, independent Russian media who think about it, who are out the country. Ukrainians think about it. There's a lot of thought going into it. But as we are here, and I have Pasolini here, Pasolini created probably the most powerful anti-fascist films. And you mentioned psychiatry. You know, his great film about the psychology of fascism was Salo, you know, which is a film about the end of the Mussolini regime, but essentially it's an orgy. It's a sadomasochistic orgy. And you mentioned fascism, and while
I think it's a fascism, exactly the type of Mussolini, Franco, Spain, Salazar, Portugal. Not, of course, the way it was in Germany. It's not Nazi regime.
But you know, when the psychiatrists talk about, and then psychiatrists were still sort of like seen as serious people, when they wrote about the fascism then, about Erich Fromm, you know, they're definitely talking about the sadomasochism involved in it, the desire to submit and to dominate others. So maybe there is something to burrow into there. Is there some sort of like, you know, pleasure historically in submitting to the silная ruka, which is a bizarre concept. You know, I remember coming to Russia when I lived there, and everyone's like, we need a Stalin. This wasn't like now. This was like, nam нужна сильная рука. We need a strong hand to punish us. And you're like, okay, maybe this is maybe more Erich Fromm territory. And then the desire to compensate that on others. I remember walking through Yakhidne, which was this now very famous village in the Chernihiv region, which was sort of liberated quite early in the war. And it was famous because basically Russian soldiers held a whole village captured there for a month. Yeah, 300 people in the basement. And kept in quite horrifying conditions and did all the things that you would expect in your worst nightmares. And I remember walking around there, and there were these bits of propaganda there everywhere. These sort of special newspapers that the soldiers had left behind. And they were all of this very, very Soviet-style propaganda, like, we are saving Ukraine from the evil fascists and all this kind of stuff. All about how the soldiers were liberators and how Ukrainians were fascists. And look, the soldier that spent a month with these people knew perfectly well that Ukraine wasn't occupied by fascists, because they told them. They knew perfectly well that these people spoke Russian to them and were free to speak Russian. So the whole argumentation for the war was bullshit. And so then you get into a space where people know that the propaganda is nonsense, but it allows you to do the sadistic things that, I'm not saying everybody, but maybe sits in all of us, but is particularly strong in some. So this idea that propaganda then becomes the legitimizer of the evil and the sadism that you want to do, I think that might be something to look at. So we often think about propaganda as brainwashing, as like, it came like a spell and like, infects people. And sometimes it works like that. We have many studies that show that propaganda can somehow, persuade people. But sometimes it's just there to do the really horrible things that you always wanted a chance to do. I don't know if you remember this, one of the best films to come out of the war is this incredible film of Перехваты, of intercepts between Russian soldiers. Yeah. And it's actually a very arty film. It's just scenes of Ukrainian life, of the intercepts of Russian soldiers. And some of them are just so honest about it. It's like, finally, I can do what I always wanted to do. Some aren't, by the way. Some are appalled. Some are like, I don't believe what we just did. But many others are like, finally, I've got to do to that what I did. And we're talking about rape and mutilation. And the conversation I'll never forget, and that I think will stay with me, was a soldier talking to his mother. And the mother's like, oh, I've always wanted to do that too. Me and you are so similar. I'm so glad that you're out there raping, murdering, pillaging, mutilating. So maybe propaganda just releases something that was waiting to get out.
I've been teaching propaganda since Dick Cheney.
That's an era.
Oh, no, that was my total. He was my ground zero for all of this. And what I've learned in teaching, you had on-hand experience, is that you can't unpropagate people. People need to want to get unpropagated. You really have to decide or see that that's a whole, like Khrushchev. Because he was totally brainwashed, and he brainwashed himself, and he explained all the famines and, the horses are dying in thousands is because some Western British person came in and sprinkled something. So you have to want to do this. Something has to happen. And there is actually, I know you work on how to confront it. I have never seen something useful that can come about and unpropagate people who do not want to get unpropagated. Something needs to happen to them.
But you teach Hollywood. Apparently, it's a very effective tool.
Hollywood is the greatest, but that's the greatest thing about American propaganda. Putin can only dream of those because you are selling a wonderful life. That's a wonderful life. You are selling things that the whole world needs to be. And actually, that's sort of fascinating about Trump is that he's arguing for things that America great again, but America is great is because give me your poor, your because that's what made America great. Anyway, yes, I do teach it, and Hollywood is a great tool, is a wonderful tool. But Putin doesn't do Hollywood. Putin does hammer over the head.
Because he doesn't know how to read the internet, right?
Exactly.
Valerie?
Okay.
Valerie?
Wait. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thanks for these interesting presentations. My question is about the Russian propaganda machine and how sophisticated is it in terms of targeting different sectors of the population? So, you think about the way that there was Russian propaganda intervention in the US election in 2016, and it was really specific. It was like down to the zip codes, like let's target these Black voters in these areas and tell them to stay home. How sophisticated is it inside Russia? Are they targeting different messages to men and to women? Are they targeting different messages to the old and to the young? Are they targeting different messages to Russians and to ethnic minorities? What's your sense of that?
Look, it's as Yevgenia pointed out, and I think most people are aware of, it's a market economy, and it has marketology everywhere. And obviously they know everything about segmentation, and they work together with the propaganda bodies, and that's been going on a very long time, and it's as sophisticated as is anywhere. So they will be using exactly the same techniques as any other marketing company in terms of segmentation. And they will be able to channel it through much more concentration than you could in a democracy. But listen, it's quite sophisticated also in the way they've distributed between TV and online. It's very, very interesting today how every security service has its own kind of telegram army. and often they're fighting with each other because Putin wants some pluralism between them. So there's not a managed democracy anymore, but Putin wants to keep the different clans fighting. So there's a little bit of tension there. Not out in the open too much, but if you know where to look. And I remember at the start of the war, Russian sociologists were kind of leaking quite a lot of the sociology that was being done internally by the Kremlin, and it was going around academic circles and talked about a lot. And I showed some of the surveys to American pollsters who work in elections, and they said they were superb, because superb in the sense of really accurate, in the sense that it was all about emotion, like very few questions about what you think, and page after page what you feel. Yeah, so they're looking for an emotional barometer of the country. And of course, what they're looking for, most likely, we don't know what they're looking for, but they're most likely looking for where people have explosive emotions, and they don't want that. You know, they do want to keep the population apathetic. And if we're talking about a vulnerability, a structural vulnerability to their propaganda, going back really since I lived there, is on the one hand, they want to keep people pretty passive. Yeah, they're very worried about protest potential, you know, this sort of like when people start getting too agitated, but then they need to motivate them. Yeah, whether it's to go to a march or to go to a war. And if there is a structural vulnerability in what they do, I think it's actually around that. And I think they've always had problems with the kind of mobilization, literally, part. They had to find different ways of counterbalancing that. So I think that's, I don't know, I remember talking to Pavlovsky before he died. He was a fascinating guy, a dissident turned Kremlin propagandist. And he used to be quite honest about this, that this was the great problem they had. That on the one hand, they wanted to keep people passive. On the other hand, they had huge problems with mobilization. So that was actually more than I went from sophistication to vulnerability, but yeah.
More questions? Because we have 3 minutes left. Yes, please.
Yeah. Oh, my question is about what Adina said about the propaganda, like basically glorifying the Chinese or the Chinese regime. I'm curious, like, do you see a disconnect in Russia today? How like the citizens feel like about China versus like the politicians, or like what the political class feels about the thoughts of the country and whatnot.
Well, the story with China was the greatest relationship, and we're going to march together into the sunset. There's a lot of Chinese visitors. There's something I don't know if you know, it's just a remarkable propaganda tool, because the Russians kind of got tired of their Lenin for a long time, because now Lenin is back. I mean, Putin doesn't like Lenin, it's a revolution, but at the same time, it gives us something to love because it was still the Soviet grandeur. So there's a Red Tour. I don't know if you've known of it. It's amazing. So the Chinese groups come and travel and see all the Lenins, take pictures of all the Lenins in the universe. I actually I witnessed a couple of them, and it was absolutely amazing, because at the time it was right before COVID-19. So they're the only people who cared about Lenin. But I also witnessed an amazing thing, is that there's a Blagoveshchensk, which is on the border with Heihe, which is, Amur River is 500 meters in between. And so the China is on one side, and a Russian village, Heihe, Chinese village. And the shuttle traders go and bring products from one side to another. And I've never seen so much hatred on personal level, and disrespect. And sort of the Chinese would go over the Russian heads, and the Russians would go over the Chinese heads. And I was standing in line, and the guy in front of me said, well, he's a Chinese, what are you waiting for? And so, but it was still not the same friendship that it is now, but it was kind of like just fell flat into Putin's face, how we are going to be living happily ever after. And it's interesting, because some of the pictures that I had, because I also photograph foreign signs in Russian cities. And that's also amazing because it's a unique civilization while you're having fashion. It was one of the greatest things that I've seen, many great things, but one of them is Fashion House Venice, Russian Fashion House Venice. That's exactly what Russian Fashion House is. How little China is present. It's getting more, but so it's not, I mean, dragging Russia away from Europe was a violent thing because Russian culture is part of the European culture. People don't need to know something specific to know about Leonardo da Vinci, but you need to be sinologist to know China. And so for the Russians, it's China is great. We're going to be just like them. But that, I mean, Peter mentioned Khrushchev. Have you heard of Khrushchev? So the Russians are, unfortunately, Putin brought it back, that kind of the sense of superiority and imperialism. And so it goes for the Chinese and like, well, we need them now, but we are the white people. And you can hear it, even from those who you wouldn't think are racist. But there is something, and I think that's another thing that has been done in this 3 years. People stop paying attention to things that even before they probably would be embarrassed to say. But now with the rhetoric that's coming from the Kremlin, with Dmitry Medvedev going crazy every day on his Telegram channel, kind of it takes down all the civilized formulas. And I think that's another value of propaganda. Suddenly, as you said, they want to rape. Suddenly people are allowed to be horrible because that makes us better and nobody understands. I think Zakharova said, or somebody said, well, Putin.
Press to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
To the first minister, right, press person, she said, well, Putin, or maybe somebody, one of them, he said, he said, well, Putin he was very nice to the Western leaders and then they betrayed him. So because they betrayed him, we can do anything. So I think it's one of these moments I think Russia is going through. Somebody asked about what are we going to do with the Ukrainians? I mean, what are Ukrainians are going to do with us? I mean, forget us, what are we going to do with them? How they can forgive? I mean, what are they going to do? And so the same thing, I think that Stalin first created when he moved nations around and never really got resolved. I think Putin has created the same kind of, I mean, we're hearing from Finland things that during the Cold War, the Finns were like, oh yeah, those Russians, I mean, you can deal with them, though it's fine. And I think China is going to be one of those.
Okay, I think, that's our time is up. Thank you so much. Let's take I want to remind you that on February the 16th, it will be the anniversary of the murder of Alexei Navalny. I will be giving a talk at Herman Institute in Columbia University, maybe on the February 18th.